Hello and welcome to Dialect. I'm Tony Gosling. Dialect is Bristol's first podcast, set up in 2001 with a Millennium Grant from the Scarman Trust. We're on Bristol Community FM 93.2 every Tuesday at noon. That's bcfmradio.com/dialect. This week, Extinction Rebellion. Well, they've shut down parts of London for the last week or so, all over Easter. A global campaign that started right here in Bristol. We hear from some of the brains behind Extinction Rebellion from Bristol University, cognitive psychology Professor Colin Davis, speaking at Redland Library recently, and also XR activist Luke Watson. But what's more dangerous, climate change or war and terrorism? It's a bit difficult to know what we should be frightened of most, isn't it, sometimes? Sri Lankan terror attack, Christchurch terror and the fire at Notre Dame in Paris. We speak to Manfred Petrisch, who runs a blog in German called Alles Schall und Rausch, which in English is All Smoke and Mirrors. What does he make of the terrorist attacks over the last couple of weeks? Dialect's produced by volunteers. We're online at dialectradio.co.uk and based at the People's Republic of Stokes Croft Arts Centre on Jamaica Street. If you have someone you'd like us to interview or would like to volunteer, have a pen ready at the end of the show. We start with Professor Colin Davis from the Cognitive Psychology Department at Bristol University from XR.
I would like to thank all of the friends of Redland Library. I am the child of librarians. My father taught librarianship. My mother worked for a while in one of those mobile libraries. I spent much of my youth, formative years in libraries, and so I really value the importance of these places, and I'm very grateful for all of those of you who are trying to defend our public libraries. I'd like to focus on political dissent, and specifically forms of dissent that might seem to go beyond usual participation in democracy. And I've chosen two books on that theme, and the first is called Disobedience and Democracy by Howard Zinn. So let me start by saying a few words about the author. Howard Zinn was interested in civil disobedience both from a philosophical and a practical perspective. Between 1956 and 1963, he was a professor of history at a college for African American women in Atlanta, Georgia. And during that time, he became a participant in the civil rights movement. And one of the first campaigns that he was involved in was actually about public libraries. So in Atlanta, up until 1959, libraries were segregated. And quite apart from the moral aspects of that, that was a major obstacle to learning if you happened to be black. So Zinn and his class decided that that would be a good place to translate some ideology into action. And when Zinn visited the library and he spoke to the director there, he was told that change was not possible because if Negroes began to use the library, it would probably lead to violence. You can read more about that campaign in one of Zinn's essays. But ultimately, the desegregation happened quietly and peacefully, and the library patrons didn't respond with violence. And Zinn quotes the governor of Atlanta, who commented, "A public library is a symbol of literacy, education, and cultural progress. It does not attract troublemakers." I think the first sentence is true. I'm less sure about the second. I guess it depends on your point of view about who's a troublemaker. The president of Spelman College seemed to decide that Zinn was a troublemaker, and he eventually fired him for radicalizing students. So this book, Disobedience and Democracy, it was a response to a book called Concerning Dissent and Civil Disobedience that was written by a Supreme Court justice called Abe Fortas. Both these books were written in 1968, which was quite a revolutionary year across the world. The Beatles were number one in the charts with a single that had Hey Jude on one side, but Revolution on the other. And it really did seem that We All Want to Change the World captured the zeitgeist. The Vietnam War was still going on, and it was a source of much dissent. And Dinh himself was arrested a number of times for protesting against the war. Many young men burnt their draft cards as a public act of disobedience to draw attention to the immorality of the government's bombing campaign, as well as the fact that the war had never been voted on by Congress. And it was these acts of civil disobedience that particularly prompted Judge Fortis's book. He considered whether draft card burning should be protected by the First Amendment on free speech, and he concluded that it shouldn't. Now, Howard Zinn was not impressed by Fortis's arguments, and he identified 9 fallacies in the reasoning. In the process, he sketched out a much more general case for civil disobedience, one that I think has relevance for today. And let me briefly say a little bit about why I think these arguments are particularly relevant for the present. And it's something that Lloyd has already alluded to. As in 1968, there is a spirit of rebellion in the air. And one of the reasons people are rebelling is to get governments to respond appropriately to the climate crisis. Many of us have been trying normal methods to bring about a change in government policy for a long time. But it hasn't been working, and the situation now is getting rather desperate. What we do over the next few years may be critical for whether humans in the future will continue to have a viable habitat. If you want to read more about the world we're heading towards, I highly recommend this recently published book, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. The opening sentence of the book is, "It is worse, much worse than you think," and it goes on to explain why. An article in The Ecologist this week says that perhaps David Wallace Wells is being too optimistic. So faced with this, many people, myself included, are turning to civil disobedience. The Extinction Rebellion campaign is based on the idea of using mass civil disobedience to try to bring about change. You might have seen the naked protest in Parliament last week. That was people from Bristol. Next week, the International Rebellion will begin. And in the UK, thousands of people will converge on Parliament Square on Monday and will cause disruption, will engage in acts of civil disobedience. That will probably get us arrested. So rather than Desert Island books, you might say that I'm choosing police cell books. Our hope is that our protest will wake people up about the climate emergency and that we might be able to persuade the government to take action. But many people are going to be unimpressed by what we do. Some will say that we're wrong simply because we're breaking the law, but others will have more thoughtful criticisms. So for that reason, I think it's worth looking at Zinn's arguments. And I'm going to mention just a few of the fallacies that he talks about that I think are pertinent to the present. His fallacy number 3 is that civil disobedience must be limited to laws which are themselves wrong. I think most people would agree that there may be a justification for breaking laws that are unjust, but Zinn argues that it's also legitimate to break just laws in the service of protesting against other bad laws or bad conditions. He gives the following example. Suppose a child is killed by a speeding car and local mothers respond by blocking traffic on the street to try to pressure the council into installing a traffic light. Judge Fortis would say that this form of civil disobedience is not justifiable because the law that they're breaking against obstructing traffic is perfectly reasonable. But Zinn says that the lives of children who live on the street are more important than traffic ordinances, and therefore this is a justifiable form of disobedience. Then he raises the stakes and asks about a situation in which many more lives are at danger. To quote from Zinn, "Is it impermissible to violate a law which is in itself reasonable and harmless, like a law against obstructing traffic, as an attempt to criticise, to halt the mass destruction of war?" And if you substitute our habitat for war in that sentence, it could be seen as a direct defence of Extinction Rebellion's tactics. And many people will respond to this argument by saying that there's no need to break the law at all, because we have political processes at our disposal. We live in a democracy. We can exercise our right to vote. But that's another fallacy that's discussed by Zinn, because it's not clear that the usual political processes were helpful in bringing about reforms like, for example, the civil rights laws that he talks about. Instead, usual politics seems to be very much about preserving the status quo. And sometimes you need to go outside the usual legal framework in order to bring about change. Now, maybe that wouldn't be necessary in a well-functioning democracy, but our system is very far from that ideal. Ultimately, though, the differences between Zinn and Judge Fortas seem to come down largely to one fundamental difference. Fortas places a high value in the law in and of itself, whereas Zinn holds that morality is the ultimate guide. His fallacy number one is that the rule of law has an intrinsic value apart from moral ends. He argues that that's just misguided. From his perspective, civil disobedience is not just to be tolerated. If we're to have a truly democratic society, it's a necessity. So I find myself agreeing with Zinn rather than Fortas. But I think my sympathy for Zinn is very much rooted in the fact that he is a man of action, not just nice words, and that he has a keen sense of justice, and he's always rooting for the underdog in society. From a purely intellectual point of view, I do have some reservations. I don't think he provides an unassailable case. I think while he's right to talk about our morality being our ultimate guide and a source of obligations, I think maybe he dismisses some of Fortas's arguments too readily. And in particular, it's reasonable to talk about citizens having an obligation to obey the law. But when circumstances give rise to a conflict between those two obligations, between our conscience and the law, we need to weigh them carefully to see which one takes priority. It's expecting too much of philosophy to be able to do that in the abstract. Individual citizens have to make the judgment for themselves and recognise that their perspective may differ from others and be prepared to face the consequences for taking a perspective that differs from the majority or from that specified by the law, and realising as well that those two might not always coincide. Finish with another quote from Zinn, which is, "Democracy is not just a counting up of votes, it is a counting up of actions."
That was Professor Colin Davis from the Cognitive Psychology Department at Bristol University from Extinction Rebellion.
My name's Luke Watson. I'm a member of Extinction Rebellion.
So, Extinction Rebellion, we see XR. Actually, it should be ER, shouldn't it?
Yeah. Doesn't roll quite as well, I think, for the sound of it.
No, it doesn't, does it? No. And also, we can go with the hourglass logo that you've got. Now, look, this is quite a new campaign. Can you just tell us about how it started? Although it's got a lot of press coverage, and obviously the people involved in it are very active.
Yeah. It's an offshoot of a group called Rising Up, which started about 2 years ago in Bristol.
And is it in other parts of the country? Is it just Bristol?
No, it's international, not just the UK.
So did it start in the UK? Or
it started in Bristol.
Wow, amazing. So what are you up to? What are you actually doing? Maybe we should start with what have you been doing so far?
So far, it's more been recruiting and doing some symbolic events to raise awareness of the movement.
So I noticed you did something up at Bristol Airport, didn't you?
Yeah.
I mean,
there was already a group doing that, in a way.
Okay.
Because a lot of people in XR have been involved in activism for a while.
Okay, so this is basically environmental activists all coming together under one kind of heading, is it?
Yeah, one shared vision of how change works.
So how does change work?
I mean, there's lots of different ways you can go about change, but
well, we're seeing that a lot of people voting in the Houses of
Yeah.
Parliament almost ineffectively for the last few months. But anyway, what's your
Our view is that non-violent direct action in the capital city is the most effective way of bringing about a change in government.
And how would that affect anything? And what I suppose even more important, what is non-violent direct action?
Non-violent direct action is breaking a law you believe to be wrong in a symbolic way in order to both highlight the injustice of that, and it also shows the violence inherent in maintaining the status quo.
Well, enforcing the law, I mean, there is surely a sense in that as well. I mean, if, some friend of yours gets murdered, you've got to go to the police and they've got to enforce the law, haven't they?
That's true, but part of non-violent action is to be accountable. So it's not like we're trying to break the law and then get away with it. We're saying we do this because we believe this is wrong.
You think
and
we're willing to change the law?
We're willing to interact with the law. Accountability kind of shows that.
Okay, so I mentioned the Bristol Airport action. What other things have been going on here locally that have come under this XR heading?
People glued themselves to the BBC, the local Bristol BBC. That was one thing.
Why?
Because one of the key messages of XR is speak the truth, and the BBC has a key role in shaping public discourse.
Well, they certainly do. I mean, through the Natural History Unit, for example, they're one of the people in the national arena that are bringing quite a lot of these environmental issues out through their programmes, aren't they?
They are bringing the issues out, but not to a degree necessary.
So if you were at the BBC producing a programme, what would it look like? So it was different to what they're doing. So all I'm saying is, what would you like the BBC to be doing?
Probably to treat it as an emergency, not as something where you can carry on the lifestyle we have. That is not possible anymore. And we have to be honest about that. That radical change is required, not because it would be nice, but for the world to be habitable for future generations.
So you're saying there is no alternative except for doing what you want?
No. XR is not advocating a particular policy. We're just saying that how we are now is heading to disaster.
Okay, but it does sound as if you haven't really got a vision. Is that fair to say? Or other than saying that the situation we're in now isn't working? I mean, isn't it part of your responsibility to be saying, rather than cursing the darkness, to be showing a light, to be leading the way a bit as well, if you've really thought through these issues?
Well, we believe that it's a systemic issue, and we also believe quite strongly in democracy, which would be great if we had it. And so one of the demands is for a citizens' assembly, so that our politics will be representative of the people of the country. And we don't think it's up to us as a minority group to decide. So instead we're asking for a procedure and then it's kind of a matter of faith in people, I suppose, which might be misplaced.
Well, I mean, I think more people involved in decisions sounds a good idea, because it seems to me a very tiny number of people, most of them chief executives of big corporations who are, by the way, also funding political parties, are making most of the decisions at the moment. Anyway, look, you're hinting there at the way you're organised. How is XR organised? Is it do you have like one leader or two leaders, or how does it work?
There's no leaders. It's supposed to be non-hierarchical. The closest you'd get is a coordinator role, which would be for a specific task, and you'd probably rotate it between the group, just because constantly trying to reach consensus is a long-winded process.
Well, very long. I mean, do you ever get there? Sometimes you're going till 1 a.m.
I think one way that makes it quicker, in a way, is that XR has been quite clear about what its vision of change is. And that's made, if you go to any of the meetings, there's induction. And what people broadly believe is made very clear with the demands and 10 principles. And then it's kind of a self-selecting sample of people who come back.
Do you want to talk about those demands and principles?
So there are 3 aims. The first one is for the government to speak the truth and to declare a climate emergency and to act as if that truth was real. The second one is to make a legally binding commitment to go carbon neutral by 2025. And the third one is to create a citizens' assembly to respond to the climate emergency.
This carbon neutral thing, I think you really have to sell that to the mass of the public, because we're made of carbon. How can we be carbon neutral?
I think it's overall. So obviously you'll use some things that will release carbon. It's kind of inevitable. But it's on balance. So if there's a certain types of agriculture sequester more carbon than they use. And we don't go to any particular policy, but there's a project called Drawdown that has shown that it's completely feasible.
And what do you say to these people that say, well, actually, climate change isn't man-made, it's changes all the time anyway?
Well, it's a matter of degree, and I mean, there's people who say the Earth is flat, and there's a point where you just have to.
But hang on, but there is some sort of argument that says that the climate does change on its own. I mean, we had in the 1600s we had the Thames freezing over. We had several years of extreme freezing cold temperatures in Britain and no crops basically. So
that was from a volcano.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying that was a specific thing that caused it?
There was something that caused it.
Okay, so. You're absolutely sure that there's no argument that man is not causing this climate change?
Yes, there's as near as you get to a consensus in the scientific community. There have been changes in the past before, but they've also been disastrous. There's been 6 mass extinctions. One of them was an asteroid. All the others were from rises in carbon in the atmosphere.
What do you think would happen if we don't do anything, Luke?
Then we'll start hitting these feedback loops where it'll run away on its own, and it will be unchangeable because there's like different steady states at which the Earth can be, and at the moment we're in one, and if we move out of that steady state, there's no telling really what will happen. It'll be disastrous. It'd be a very unpleasant world to live in.
Would it be very hot or very cold or what?
There are actually some models. One point where the Earth can stabilise is it's all completely iced over. That's unlikely. You don't know. It's hard to tell the exact probabilities, but probably be hotter. Mm-hmm. It's just once you move out of steady state, it kind of goes wild and there's no predicting what will happen.
I mean, I think if you talk to anyone that lives in sub-Saharan Africa, they'll tell you something is definitely changing with our weather. You know, people finding it very difficult to grow crops, etc. Anyway, so we're getting back to how you're organised. How is it possible to actually make decisions when you've got such a lot of people and you say that actually nobody's in charge?
Because we want the same thing. I think that. And the way of doing XR manages to do that is to have quite a lot of trainings and to be clear and transparent about what it's about.
Now, I noticed there was actually a piece in the Bristol Post about XR doing a training session of non-violent direct action here in Bristol. Was that quite a big event, small event? And, you know, what's involved in that? I suppose the idea is to just prepare people for what to expect.
Yeah, there's a little bit on your rights and what to expect if you get arrested. There's some role-playing and working at de-escalating a situation. So like if someone shouts at you, a good idea is to start at the same volume as them and slowly calm down. And so you kind of mirror them in that way.
I understand you're planning something in April in London. So first of all, why in London? And secondly, what are you planning?
London because it's the capital and it's where the elites live. And they're more concerned by what affects them. And it'll be Monday the 15th at 11 a.m. in Parliament Square. And first is to meet there, and then to shut down central London by blocking the roads.
But I mean, surely what about ambulances, things like that? Are they going to be allowed to go through?
The emergency services do have contingency plans for these type of things, and they've been warned far in advance.
That's another good question, isn't it? Do you chat to the police beforehand? Do you say we're going to do this and that? I mean, there must be a temptation to not give your plans away to them.
No, we're completely open, because so many left-wing movements have been infiltrated by the police and things like that. One way of getting around that is to just be completely upfront.
Well, we've had this Pitchford inquiry, haven't we, recently, with the police sending agents in having children even with activists who haven't even broken the law. And that's ground to a halt because the police have refused to give the names of all of the people involved, and a complete miscarriage of justice, really. Yeah. So those that have committed crimes within the police have just been allowed to get away with it. I suppose you might expect that. The police are not going to find themselves guilty of breaking the law. In fact, what some people have described as hacking people's lives. The sort of thing that we were told that the East European Stasi used to do has been happening in Britain to legitimate environmental campaigners like yourself that haven't actually even broken the law. So is there a frosty relationship or a good relationship with the police?
I think that depends on the individuals within XR, but we...
It might depend on the individual police too.
And the individual police as well. Yeah.
But being open is an interesting... So you're able to just tell the police exactly what you're planning to do.
Yeah, you say, this is what we do, and they say, you shouldn't do that, that's illegal. And we say, OK, we're going to do it anyway. Right. And it's hard to get annoyed or aggressive with someone who's just been completely open and quite friendly. And it offers the opportunity for backfiring.
OK, so if anyone's interested in joining you in London, what should they do?
They should go on the Extinction Rebellion website. There's a briefing of what to expect. It's a bit vague because we have to see
that gives you a bit of an idea. But, I mean, there are local groups meeting, aren't there? So probably one of the things to do is actually go and meet people and talk to them.
Yes.
Here in Bristol. You've got two groups, you said, one at the Malcolm X Centre and one in Southville. So what's the best way to find out where they are and go along and meet some XR people?
There's a Bristol-specific Extinction Rebellion website. So you can search for that, and that has both of them, all of you on Facebook. You can use...
Can we have that? Can you give us that website now?
xrbristol.org.uk.
Where and when do the groups meeting? Because that might be handy for people if maybe they haven't got the internet. Yeah. Or like me, the internet isn't working at home from time to time, or cut off or whatever.
The one in South Bristol is on Tuesdays at the Quaker Meeting House, 52 Wedmore Vale, and the other one is at the Malcolm X Community Centre on City Road on Wednesdays.
At what time?
They are both at 6 to 7 is a meal, and then from 7 to 9 is the meeting. So if you have time, it's quite nice to go to the meal and have a chat with people. The food's pretty good normally.
Luke Watson from Bristol Extinction Rebellion, more power to your elbow. So Luke Watson was an activist, now back to the brains behind Extinction Rebellion, and Professor Colin Davis from Bristol University.
So as I mentioned before, one of the difficulties that one encounters when thinking about civil disobedience is the fact that one has to think about different perspectives, and one's own perspective on the clash between moral and legal obligations may well differ from others. And of course, a good way of exploring different perspectives is through literature. So for my wildcard book, I've chosen a recent novel that's all about different perspectives on protest. It's called Your Heart is a Muscle the Size of a Fist. And it's the debut novel by Sunil Yapa. And I think it's really an extraordinary book. It's about an event from not too long ago, the protest against a World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle that took place at the end of 1999. It kind of ushered in the new century. And this protest, it began as the largest act of mass civil disobedience in the United States for many years, with around 50,000 peaceful protesters. But it descended into mayhem, and it's now often referred to as the Battle of Seattle. And the novel focuses on a single day, and it tells the story from the perspective of multiple different characters, protesters, police officers, a conference delegate from the Third World. And each of these characters is trying to do what's right by their lights. They each have a moral sense, but it pulls them in different directions. The police officers, of course, are driven by a belief in law and order, but not in a mindless way. They're motivated by a genuine wish to serve and to protect. And the protesters, on the other hand, are driven to break the law by a strong sense of what's right, by a deep empathy for people in the third world, for the poor, people whose homes are being destroyed, who are being forced into virtual slave labour by free trade agreements that are really all about corporations getting access to cheap sources of labour that have the lowest possible working conditions. And the book portrays each of the characters sympathetically, it builds the tension relentlessly, and it captures the tragedy of how a non-violent protest descended into violence. And part of the tragedy of the book is that it feels as though there's a certain inevitability about the way events play out. And a further tragedy is how the complexity of the situation is ultimately reduced to a brief headline, a scrolling banner on the TV saying, "Violent protesters clash with police." So to give you a flavour of the book, I'm going to do a short reading from chapter 2, where we're introduced to John Henry, who's a veteran of nonviolent resistance and one of the organisers of the Seattle protest. And at this point, he's watching the march and he's surveying his people as they go by, chanting slogans. They said, "The future belongs to us." And maybe it did, but they looked so young and fragile. And when the time came, would they have courage? Would they have the discipline to make it so? Look with him at his people. This man who once preached from a pulpit, John Henry, who was wound up and weary with too much love, too much joy, too much rage. How many shelter cots that barely registered the man's weight, so light he was. The soft pillow of how many stone steps had cradled his head. John Henry, who had lost his church, look with him at his people. Look at his God made manifest in every form and shape of the broken world. Look with him at how they exit the church in an orderly fashion and tip their chins to the sky. Look at how they come from the darkness of their homes, backs stiff, stretching and tying the bandanas tight, checking one another's faces for an idea of what violence this day might bring. Look with him at these wet American faces, ordinary and beautiful, and tell me you don't feel more than a little bit afraid. They wanted to tear down the borders, to make a leap into a kind of love that would be like living inside a new human skin, wanted to dream themselves into a life they did not yet know. He heard them in the streets saying, "Another world is possible." And beneath his ribs, broken and healed, and twice broken and healed, and thrice broken and healed, he shuddered and thought, God help us. We are mad with hope. Here we come.